Thank you, Val. And thanks, Val, so much for this forum. I think it's such a critical topic, and it's an honor to be in the presence of this audience who are quite sophisticated. My background is I had a background in U.S. government. I was in the CIA and also at DHS. My last assignment was as the Chief of Staff of the Department of Homeland Security. And then since then, I've gone on to form, along with Secretary Chertoff, it's basically a boutique advisory firm that both advises on security and invests in security, called the Chertoff Group. One of the key things too is since then I've remained active in cyber policy with the United States government. Today I'm what's called a government special employee on the Homeland Security Advisory Council to Secretary Nielsen at DHS, where we're looking at a number of the key threats in cyber, where I'm also participating in the task force focused on countering foreign influence, and look forward to a great discussion today with these eminently qualified co-panelists. Oran?
Oran Hollander, head of cybersecurity for Telefonica in Germany. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for over 15 years. Started in the Israeli Defense Forces in the cyber realm in the intelligence corps. After that, moved to private consulting firms, from small ones to bigger ones like EY. And about 4 years ago, moved to Germany to take on the current role, dealing with all aspects of cyber and Telefonica. Looking forward for the discussion. Hans.
Yes, hello. Hans-Rem Dünn is my name. I'm the president of the German Cybersecurity Council. I started in the Ministry of Economy. I was responsible for the Federal Network Agency, Bundesnetzagentur in Germany, yes, responsible for energy and so on. And then I generated a startup together with Arne Schönbohm. He's the current president of the National Cybersecurity Authority, the BSI in Germany. And after that, we founded the Cybersecurity Council together with the 16 states in Germany with their own law enforcement, with the DAX 30 concerns in Germany, and with the research environment, the industry, and the public sector. And now we have 186 members, and we generate a platform, and we want to reach the decision maker level. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, Rick Longenecker. So I have some time in the nuclear fuel industry. I used to be a nuclear fuel inspector. After that, worked with the United Nations for a number of years, setting up the global security program, ending up in Geneva. Now I'm the head of security for Verisure Smart Alarms, which is the largest home security and small business security company, which is IoT based for our services in Europe.
Excellent. And I'd like to point out that Rick and Hans are alumni. They joined us last year, so we'll definitely get back to what we discussed last year and this year, how it has evolved. Definitely tremendously evolved. So Chad, let's start with you. In terms of critical infrastructure security and the cyber aspect of it, there is definitely a kind of a disconnect, and it's evolving. What are your thoughts, and how do you, what are the poignant points that you want to raise for critical infrastructure cybersecurity?
Great, thank you, Val. I think for this audience and for a forum like the multinational forum like this, the main thing that I wanted to try to put before the group for, I think, a more intense discussion is a really tough topic, and that is the topic of deterrence. Critical infrastructure in the United States, in my country, about 85% of that is owned by the private sector, not by the government. And so when you step back and look at it, the paradigm is very difficult, because if we think back to the nuclear threat, it's almost the inverse of the nuclear threat, right? In the nuclear threat, if you were a nuclear engineer in the 1950s, there was no better place to go than the United States government if you're wanting to be at the cutting edge. So from a human talent point of view, the government dominated. From a resource point of view, the federal budget was growing and significant. They dominated the actual underlying framework, where we spent in our country and with our allies multi-billion-dollar infrastructure in order to detect anywhere on the globe. We could literally ascertain within seconds if there was the launch of a nuclear weapon anywhere on the planet. We knew exactly where the plume was, we knew the trajectory, and that enabled a doctrine of both attribution and retribution. And we had a publicly stated policy through our command and control response that was very hierarchical, going from the combatant commander for STRATCOM all the way, that controls the nuclear weapons, all the way up to the president. And that would be done in a very quick way and with very little regard to the consequences in terms of if we had to retaliate, there was definitely going to be significant large-scale destruction. If you step and look at the cyber approach, the cyber paradigm, it's actually the inverse in many respects, right? Which is today the U.S. government and our other governments around the world are not dominating the human talent. In many cases, they're not dominating the cyber technology. If you look at today, the cash on Apple's balance sheet alone, just to put this in context, is the equivalent of, if you took all the market capitalization of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and GD all combined. So just think about that literally the resources in the private sector, the talent in the private sector are outstripping our government's capabilities. And if you look at it in terms of the command and control scenario, it is, unlike the nuclear threat, very hard to get attribution. And in terms of retribution, we need to have a dynamic and decentralized response in order to deal with this high wave, high volume, asymmetric threat versus the command and control, very hierarchical approach in the nuclear threat. So what I think is happening in the area of critical infrastructure that's so important is right now we know for a fact, and it's in our country, we've seen it, and in many of your countries you've seen it, critical infrastructure is not theoretically being probed and targeted. It's actually becoming one of the dominant forms of state actor activity. And so we saw that, for example, unfortunately in the Ukraine, during the tensions with Russia. It's no accident that their utilities went down, for 3 days, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. We saw with WannaCry, a North Korean effort disguised as a commercial activity with ransomware, which in fact was all about probing attack vectors in critical infrastructure that brought down hospitals, brought down multinational corporations like Maersk and FedEx, causing hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. And so at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that nation states are probing critical infrastructure. We do not have, as a global community, a stated doctrine of what will be governing nation-state behavior in this space. And what is that leading to? It means that if there aren't costs to probing and, in some cases, disrupting critical infrastructure, there's no disincentive for states to do it. And Oran has a great phrase, and I want to make sure to give him credit for it. He phrased it as, this will be the war between wars, meaning this will be the low-level conflict of probing critical infrastructure until the moment we have outright conflict between states. And so the challenge I'd like to put before this group is one of the key topics is what Brad Smith called us to consider as a digital Geneva Convention. Some stated doctrine that we can get comfortable with as a group around which critical infrastructures are unacceptable for states to tamper with, and if they do so, what will be the costs in order to deter that?
Absolutely. So, Oran, your thoughts. You are in the middle of the transport and the telecommunication industry, and you've seen this for yourself from a defense side as well. So, your thoughts around? Yeah, I had interaction with the topic both in the telco industry and also in my time with the public sector back in Israel. Like Chad mentioned before, the war between wars, this silent war that is ongoing on a regular basis, is all about getting a foothold, because when cyber war will be waging, it will not be from 0 to 100, meaning you will have to be in a position of leverage in order to take advantage of what you have achieved. And as a result, this is a continuous war, right? So, and because of that, it needs to be looked at and dealt with continuously as well. So it's not just about how do you prepare for the crisis, which is also very important, but also how do you assess where you are on a continuous basis.
I think one of the key issues that needs to be discussed is, and it's the same in the private sector, is the aspect of identification. And that is not only about how do you identify what are your critical assets, but also having the actual discussion about what is the definition of a critical asset or critical infrastructure, because this is continuously updated as time goes by. So one of the examples that I like using, for example, is the notion of a connected car, which part of the world of IoT. Nowadays, when you look at it, sometimes maybe it feels like something that's quite remote, far away. But if you have somebody manipulating connected cars to a point where you have your transportation infrastructure being damaged, if you consider a bridge to be critical infrastructure, would you not consider also the cars that can block it? Absolutely. So updating the definition, understanding what really are the critical assets, is, I think, something that can be highly improved, and the conversation needs to start from there.
Certainly, certainly. So Hans, expanding on those two topics, I think in terms of the deterrence side and the different aspects of critical infrastructure, where do you see this going from your point of view?
Yes, you speak about deterrence. That is very interesting. But the problem is, and I can only speak for Germany and perhaps for Europe, last week we had a big meeting with the energy suppliers in Athens, with the ENISA, the European Authority for Cybersecurity. And I think the problem is that we have no understanding. The people don't know that they have a big, large neighborhood, connected neighborhood. In Germany, we have 900 energy suppliers. We have 1,943 hospitals. And that is critical infrastructure. Or you can say, okay, what is critical infrastructure? But I say energy suppliers are critical infrastructure. And we have in Germany an IT security law. And every of the 900 energy suppliers have to implement a ISMS system, ISO 27001, in the last 3 years. Normally you need around about 16 months to implement such a process. It's not cybersecurity, it's a process. And what do you think, how many energy suppliers have implemented such a system in Germany, in the biggest economy in Europe? What do you think? 10. Wow. No. 5.9%. And that is a problem. And we have a national authority, the BSI, and last week we had a big cyber attack to the members of the German parliament, to some very popular actors, and they speak, oh, that is a GAU, yes, in Germany. That is an attack of our society. No, it's a normal daily business data leak. And now they want a new authority and so on. And we have a lot of reporting systems for the healthcare sector, for the energy sector, but everything is pseudo. And I think we need a better understanding. We need a understanding on the decision maker level. We have a lot of technical operatives conferences, yes, and 99% of the CEOs in Germany, they say, wow, that is an important, sexy topic. But only 7% invest in cybersecurity. I'm a member in the board of directors of a big clinic concern. We make round about 600 million euros per year. And we invest 0.002% in cybersecurity, with around about 700 different systems in a normal German hospital. That is a big market for the industry, but where are the talents? Where are all the guys? Yeah, we have a big fight for talents, not only in Europe, also in the world. And we need new education systems. I think that's a point for later. But now we start in Germany with a new initiative of 7 billion euros for the 40,000 schools, for the education system, for the IT infrastructure. But nobody speaks about pedagogical approaches and systems. And I think we have to start it. And in Germany, they speak in the last press conference from the BSI, and I know Arnie Schönbohm very good. I like him. It's a good friend of me. He said, we have no problem in the energy sector. We had only attacks to our office systems, no scatter. Wow. And look at our German and French power plants. They don't have to attack the power plant. They go to the thousands of engineers' offices and they attack them in January. It is horrible for us, and it's not a problem for a Chinese or a Russian attack to occupy our local energy suppliers. And then it's not a local problem of a village or a city, then it is minimum an European problem, and we are in the beginning. And thank you for this conference, because it's very important to reach the decision maker level. And but we are in the beginning, and we need new approaches. Thank you.
Absolutely. So expanding on that topic, Hans, and going on to Rick, and you have had a fascinating career with you know, both from the real critical infrastructure side, you know, global critical, and then also United Nations, and now in private sector. How do you see these three, you know, coming together and you know, answering some of the issues that we just talked about?
Well, I guess, I mean, I really focus now, I mean, I work in a private sector company in multiple countries, and I can say that the integration, cooperation, and the regulation of government's actually been really, really helpful. If you look at the stuff in California, GDPR, love it or hate it, actually has pushed us in the right direction. There has been significant investment and thought about this, although we have a ways to go. The National Cybersecurity Center in the UK and the culture of digital media and sport, putting out the IoT guidelines, has actually been a significant push. And if you kind of talk about the emphasis, I mean, I still talk to people in nuclear. I talk how things are going, of course, from the UN perspective. But basically, there still is a lot more emphasis that's needed in this area. And quite frankly, you know, attribution, you know, a convention. We had a rousing discussion about it, is where do you actually place that? How do you actually start? And so I'll let others discuss that. But I guess from a, you know, from a corporate perspective, when we had a regulation aspect that, you know, we want to avoid a fine, we want to maintain our image, our brand, you know, so of course we're going to work extremely hard on this. And then from the other perspective, we actually look at security as a marketing tool over time. So, for instance, if we meet the UK Cybersecurity Essentials and we meet the UK, you know, IoT minimum security requirements, we can actually put that as a brand, like anything else, on our product. And our product is sales. I mean, we do security, we sell peace of mind, but we have to get in your house first. So does Amazon, so does everybody else if you're selling security. And more or less that government regulation, that the government, you know, minimum standards that kind of pushes you in that general direction will kind of be what propels industry to kind of continue to push in this area and build resilience. I guess the last point I would have is that basically one of the things that we don't talk about too much is that I kind of expect a large-scale outage of the internet or some other main infrastructure in the next couple of years. We kind of have to expect this is going to happen. And what are we going to do about that? And of course, society is going to be resilient. Things are going to get less convenient for a while. But I don't know if that's actually discussed too much, that this is a distinct possibility. I mean, our infrastructure is more sensitive than we actually, you know, largely consider.
Okay. So let's, I think all moot points, especially the resilience part. So Chad, you talked about deterrence and expanding on that topic. You know, hearing that there are three dimensions, you know, there are new vectors coming up, but also new open areas such as connected vehicles. We talked about the different regulations that are there, but like 5.9% adoption of compliance and implementation, and probably so. And then the resilience. How do we get there? What is the vision that you would like to paint for this and the audience and the global audience that we can take to the next level?
Thanks. Well, I think the vision I would go back to is, again, this parallel that we talked about with the nuclear threat. So there's only one state on the face of the earth that's ever used nuclear weapons against another country, and that's my country. The United States dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's only one state that reportedly, there's two states that reportedly first weaponized cyber. And I don't know because I was not in government, so please, I want to be clear that I don't know and I'm not confirming or denying it, but David Sanger's reporting on Operation Olympic Games claims that both the Mossad and Unit 8200 in Israel, along with the United States, launched Stuxnet to take down the Iranian nuclear program. If that's true, again, the United States is one of the greatest innovators, whether it's in nuclear or in cyber. And if we don't start establishing norms, I'm not here to be hypocritical and say that, hey, it's only Russia, it's only China. What I'm trying to suggest is that if you look at those parallels, we ended up being the innovator and then realizing that we had kind of there's a genie in a bottle that's been unleashed, and we've got to now, even on our own selves, begin to develop norms. And what's happening right now, as Oran, I think, so eloquently put it, this war between wars, the silent war that's going on, that's becoming not so silent, right? If you look at the World Economic Forum's cyber research that was just released this year called Our Shared Digital Future, what you'll see in there is that they show that there were over 4.5 billion records that were compromised just in the first half of 2018 versus 2.7 billion for all of 2017. They also noted that it cost the global economy over $400 billion, and that 74% of all businesses globally can expect to be hacked this year. And of those that are being hacked, an important critical piece of that can be handled by the private sector, but the one area that the nation states in a forum like the Cyber Future Dialogue can play an important role is in this area of establishing norms. So how do we look at that? How do we begin? What I'm suggesting is that this forum look at that first proposal by Microsoft and several other companies called the Digital Cyber Convention. And you think of the paradigms on nuclear. The United States, even though we were the first to use it, recognized the dangers that if we didn't get some norms. And so we helped, along with other allies, develop the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. That also same paradigm was used in the development of other weapons of mass destruction. Think of chemical weapons, biological weapons, where we have developed treaties and conventions. I'm not saying that they're going to be perfect, but one of the big criticisms that you're going to hear is, well, you're never going to get everybody to sign up. It's going to, how effective it will really be. To me, that's all excuses for not starting. And we can absolutely start if we pick maybe 1, 2, or 3 critical sectors that we can all agree on. What I think others have suggested is let's start with 2 kind of key areas. What are the critical infrastructures that threaten human life? There I can think of, I think Hans mentioned power, so the power grid, this hospitals Hans mentioned, I think that's exactly right. Let's just start with those 2. Or what would destabilize the global community economically? There you think of banks, financial. On any given day, all banks are bankrupt if every depositor decides to go pull their deposits. The one thing that in our modern lifetimes could create a global financial meltdown is the day you and I open up our financial statements and they're not accurate, and we then think, oh my God, I better get my hard cash out because I can no longer trust the digital records are accurate. That could create a global economic meltdown. So let's start small, let's start incremental, but let's start.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great thoughts. Oran, what do you think about, we talked about the need to start somewhere, right? And Chad pointed out power grids and banks. In your sector specifically, it's what connects those banks and everyone, right? So what do you think about refresh and restart on the critical infrastructure around telecom and networks?
So I would say that what we're finding generally all around is that we're continuously reliving history. So ever since the first virus coming out, then antivirus after that, network attack, firewall after that, and so on, it's a continuous catch-up game. So this asymmetry between attack and defense has been debated for a very long time. We see it everywhere. It's becoming even a bigger issue when you go into the world of IoT. Especially when you're creating devices that are much more mass in numbers, are much more basic in terms of capability. So if you want to do updates and change what you've put there before, So we're actually making things a bit more complicated because we're looking at security as an afterthought. I would say the awareness for security and integrating it into the delivery process is much better than before. But in relation to the amount of new functionality that is being delivered, we're still behind. One of the things that I'm actually mostly passionate about in the way where I think that nations can really deal with the threat is more about where can they leverage nation-level capabilities for defense purposes. Trying to sort of minimize the time span between when an attacking capability is created until the proper defense is established as well. I think the major challenge is really about, at least for nations, is where do you balance the need for confidentiality and the capabilities that you create versus still wanting to protect against them potentially for protecting your critical infrastructure against those same types of attacks being waged by other countries, or not necessarily even countries, proxies, or even just for criminal activity or financial gain. So there are a few things that I think that nations can take advantage of. So for example, considering the fact that the attacking capabilities are so much more advanced, one of the things that I would expect nations to be able to identify, or nation-state levels, is my critical infrastructure already compromised? Because like we said, this is an ongoing battle, and most chances are that if there is an asset that has been identified by an attacking entity that will be needed in a future conflict, I would want to get a foothold there already, meaning that, and also the paradigm has shifted to, I have been already compromised, so how do I minimize the impact? How do I bounce back much quicker? So for example, something called compromise assessment, which is where I go in and my assumption is that I've been compromised, now I'm just looking for where it is. Utilizing nation-state level capabilities to find those types of agents within your network, I think, is something that is not really being utilized as much. Besides that, when people think cyber, it's usually this fancy digital aspect. Everything is hyper-connected. There are no borders, and that's true. But there's a reason also why things like human factor and supply chain are also going up in importance. And if I'm trying to get a role in the government, I'm going to go through very strong scrutiny before I'm going to be accepted. And obviously, if I'm not a citizen, most chances I'm not going to be accepted in any way. But on the other hand, if I want to go and work for a critical infrastructure company that have severe repercussions on a company's economy, in a country's economy, the vetting is not even close to being the same. And I think that they're utilizing countries' capability to do proper vetting, both for personnel alongside vendors and partners that you work with, especially considering, you know, the chase after cost reduction and globalization, and you find yourself getting services from countries you never even knew. I think having countries involved in that is also something that is very important, on top of course, orchestrating the regular things that are being done at the moment, regulation, threat intelligence sharing, which is in its infancy, and so on.
Absolutely. I'm sure we'll get to the threat intelligence sharing part. Of course, there is a topic on that, but excellent points. Hans, what do you see in terms of the government involvement, and Oran also picked up the topic of how do you trust, like the supply chain basically of your network and environment, right? And also, how do you see this coming together? Are nations ready to do this compromise assessments on themselves?
I think today I heard that they will present in space of the World Economic Forum the new white paper from the energy group, yes, with Boston Consult and with the former chief of Swisscom. That's a good first step, but I think we have to start before. In Germany and in Europe, we have the big problem, together with the government, that we don't understand and don't control our own systems. And if you see, yesterday we had a big picture with the chief of the Cybersecurity Center from the German Telekom in Bonn. Arne Schönbohm says that is the new Beersheba of Germany. And who is the main supplier of the German telecom? For the law enforcement, for the government, for our SCADA systems. And by the way, a lot of our SCADA systems are 25 years old. That is Huawei. And now we can stop the discussion about cybersecurity, about cyber espionage, about the backbone of the German industry, the SMEs. And I think that we should change together with our friends. And I think we have to support more disruptive innovations. Now we start in Germany with a new EDIC agency with 100 million euros, that is nothing. Go to the United States, it is 110 billion euros. We have in Germany no private equity environment. That is a big problem. If you go to a German bank and say, hey, I have a good disruptive innovation in cybersecurity, they say, oh, where's the business plan? Please come later in 8 months. That's not enough. And that is a big problem. And you see it. We have the data leak scandal last week in Germany with a hyper TV program and so on. But they don't understand it and they don't invest in cybersecurity. And we need a structure. We need platforms. But look at the energy sector. We have, for example, no platform for the energy sector in the European Union. And now we start with our council with our own energy hub, but that is in the beginning. Yes, the big energy, the Vattenfall, the E.ON, they have no platform together. And I think that is a big problem, and we have to start to generate own systems. Yes, it cannot be that we get China software and hardware and that we get cybersecurity from Russia. Yes, and I think we need a standardization. We need security by design. If you want to buy an aircraft, you want a safe landing, happy landing. Yes, and I think that's the same in the IT industry. And I think that is a big problem. And we need an open box. We need a platform, an international platform where we say, okay, if you produce software or hardware, we will check it. Okay. And that is not easy. Yes, don't misunderstand me. Yes, if you get an update, then it's an old product. Yeah, but I think we need international standardization together with Russia, with China, with India, with the European Union, and with the United States, and then it is authentic.
Okay, excellent. Rick, your thoughts on this?
Well, I kind of mentioned it earlier. I think the UK is on the right track. I had a funny thought when I was sitting here. What about tax breaks for cybersecurity investment for businesses? That sounds like a great thing to lobby for, because that's kind of the bottom line driver. But yeah, more regulation. We were discussing CE certification, UL certification in America. Basically the possibility for also regulation as far as cyber is concerned. I mean, this is all going to drive it. And yeah, just increased guidance, increased regulation, but in the right perspective. Yeah, and tax breaks. Yeah.
Okay. We got 2 minutes, so maybe 30 seconds of closing thoughts, right across, and then maybe Rick, you just complete, and then we'll go backwards.
I've said enough. I'm good.
All right.
Thank you.
Hans, how about some closing thoughts?
Yes, I think it's very important to organize more events like here today, like with CyNet, with the German Cybersecurity Council, with our friends in the world, with everybody. And I think it's our responsibility. And if you know, normally in Germany we need 218 days to understand that we have an incident. And that is primary. The reason is that in 80% of all the cases, the problem is awareness. And please, let's start to organize, a hacker soup, yes, in the cafeteria, yes, of your company. Then it's a big advantage. And then we can speak later about China and to control our own system. But at first, we need awareness for the employees and for the management. Absolutely. And not only for the CIO or the IT security officer.
It's just
a question
wholesome
of the
awareness.
CEO. Yeah?
Wholesome awareness. That's
Yes.
the most point. Great. Thank you,
Thank you.
Hans. Oren, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that the fight that we had as security people in the beginning is to try to convince decision makers that security is not just a technical issue, technological issue, but it's a business issue. And now I think the fight is also to make it clear that it's not just a business issue, but also a safety issue. And I think that these types of forums and discussions, considering the convergence of digital world, physical world, and our continuous dependence to a point of almost over-dependence on technology, is putting us in a situation where if we don't have these discussions early enough, then it might be a little too late to deal with. So great initiative and good time to talk about it.
Excellent. And then Chad, we're getting the hook, so but your thoughts as well to close this panel?
Just a quick provocative thought in closing. So going back to deterrence, the two core elements, the two core elements that you need for deterrence to work is a credible attribution capability with a stated doctrine of retaliation. So attribution, retaliation. And right now, if you look at it, the good news is that we're starting to see attribution. We attributed WannaCry, for example, to the North Koreans publicly. The problem is, can anyone in this room tell me what was the consequence to North Korea for doing that? And by the way, it was not just an attack on critical infrastructure, but it was an egregious, indiscriminate attack that not only affected hospitals in the UK, auto plants in Japan, and even in the United States, shipping companies. But if you look at even their own ally, China, had universities that went down because of WannaCry. So if we're going to have attribution to an actor who's actually engaged in this type of targeting of critical infrastructure in a completely indiscriminate way, at least Stuxnet, whoever did it, was trying to be surgical in that attack. This type of indiscriminate attack, you need to be able to have retribution. And some of the government have told me, well, we did it, we had a retribution against North Korea. My point is, unless you put a head on a spear that is public, then the deterrence doesn't work. So we have an opportunity with North Korea, who the whole world can agree should never have done that, even their own ally, China, who was a victim of the attack. And we need to, it's not too late to publicly take retribution so that we prevent future attacks like that. Use this as a teachable moment. It's not too late. And that can begin what, Rick used to work at the IAEA on the nuclear side. I think we need a equivalent, a multilateral, multinational entity like IAEA that can do cyber attribution the way IAEA does nuclear on their side.
Excellent. Very, very strong note. We closed that with a very, very strong note. So great points taken. And that sets the stage for the next 5 panels to expand this. But thank you very much. I'd like to thank Chad, Oren, Hans, and Rick. Very nice. Thank you. The next panel is on how do we solve this with talent and capacity. So I'd like to welcome MJ, who's chairing this panel, and he will introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Just want to say.
All right, guys, we'll get started. I know we're running a couple of minutes behind, but thank you very much. What a tremendous panel before, and I'll go through a couple of comments, a couple of things that I captured as I was listening to the guys. Really fantastic data, but let me introduce myself, and then I'll have the panelists introduce themselves here, starting with Nasir. But myself, MJ Vaidya, I'm a partner with Ernst & Young, as well as I've been teaching with NYU for the last 7 years. I really do enjoy that. And I enjoyed Oren's comments. I was prior to EY, I was the CISO with General Motors, where I led the connected car security strategy. So very interesting comments in terms of telecom and what that means as far as IoT is concerned. So looking forward to this panel. Nasir.
Yeah, hi. My name is Nasir Memon. I'm a professor of in the Computer Science and Engineering Department at New York University. I founded the cybersecurity program there in 1999, a long time ago. And currently I'm also the Associate Dean for Online Learning.
Great. Hey, Alan.
So I will go next.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm Alan Cohn. I'm a partner at the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson in Washington, D.C. I co-chair the blockchain and cryptocurrency practice there. I was previously an assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. I had the privilege of serving with folks like Chad, Rod, and a whole bunch of other great folks. I'm also an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law, and I've taught classes there on national security and domestic incident management, domestic preparedness, things of that nature, for over 10 years. So.
Thank you, Alan. Wouter.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wouter Veenstra. I work as a manager outreach and partnerships at the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise at the Secretariat, which is based in The Hague in the Netherlands. Our organization is focused on cyber capacity building worldwide. I will talk about that later. That's it for now.
Thank you. Good. Sasha.
Yeah, my name is Sascha Meyer. I'm the head of IT and cyber resilience from IWC Schaffhausen, the watchmaker. And also next to it, I'm also doing trainings for cybersecurity on an academy in Zurich, also focusing on awareness and general ICT security trainings.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks everyone. And I think what's interesting is if you look across this panel, we have private, public sector, academia covered, so it would be great to hear everyone's comments and thoughts on this topic. And it's a very important topic as far as cyber education is concerned. You know, how do we leverage this very important platform when it comes to cybersecurity to drive education, to drive STEM, to drive STEAM education globally speaking? And that's what we're going to talk about today. I just want to capture a couple of things that from the previous panel that came up. From Chad, human talent gap is outstripping our capability. Or in connected car and the challenges it presents from an IoT perspective and the skill sets and skill gaps that it presents. Hans, where's the talent? New education systems are needed in the connected systems and environment. And then Rick also mentioned security is a marketing tool. So is this security just a CISO problem, or does it extend to the business as well as law schools and other areas as well? So definitely would love to hear some thoughts here. Nasir, maybe we'll start with you. From an academic perspective, when you think about cybersecurity, a lot of challenges in this space. What do you see as far as education gaps are concerned in this area? Not just from an NYU perspective, but across the U.S., but of course globally as well.
So one is a gap of capacity, right? The number of graduates we produce. At NYU, we've had a pretty robust program for 15, 20 years, 100 people a year, and the need is a few orders of magnitude more than that, right? So academia needs to sort of develop ways to be able to sort of fill this gap in ways that are affordable, scalable, and also more open. I think one of the things that academia does is it has a very high bar to entry. The fancier school I am, the harder it is for you to get in. It should not be that way. And so the openness factor should also be addressed by academia. Those are a few thoughts that come to my mind right away. There's a lot more to be done.
Thank you. Yeah. There's more to cover as well. Yeah. Alan, obviously, a very strong background from a government perspective and teaching it from a law school perspective. Any thoughts on your end? Yep.
So it's interesting. When I was teaching, I started teaching at Georgetown Law at the same time I started at Homeland Security. And it was during the 2008-2009 transition, when somebody came from the General Counsel's office and did a presentation on emergency management law in the US for the transition team, and they got it wrong. And so I ended up pulling together a casebook as a result of that, just so that we had it compiled, and the General Counsel's office went on to compile a better compilation. But the point is, I'd echo that point that was made on the earlier panel that Rick made, but broaden it out. Cybersecurity is not just a technical problem from a people perspective. There is an enormous challenge with STEM and STEAM education and making sure that we have people in that pipeline, but we must make sure that we're educating people outside of that pipeline as well, particularly people who are going to go into leadership positions, whether it's in industry, in government, in civil society. You think about the way that the military rotates people around so that they pick up different skills. We need to make sure that we are incorporating into business programs, into legal programs, into other types of professional programs, and the professional development programs that industry uses and the government uses, an awareness of this subject, an understanding of the threats, an understanding of how we manage risk in this area, how we coordinate and cooperate. Some of the trends that emerge from future studies now, obviously people see a retreat to perhaps more to national borders, more reassertion of national sovereignty, and that's all true in the physical world, but in the cyber world, it doesn't respect those same types of boundaries. So making sure that there is a complementary set of education outside of the STEAM and STEM and technical aspects, I think is just as important and needs just as much attention as making sure that STEM and STEAM pipeline is there.
Great point. And Wouter, when you think about partnerships, is this just a university, college level issue? Alan just mentioned it needs to be continuous across broader than just IT or security space. Any thoughts from a partnership perspective you could share? Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I think it should be much broader than just on that level. E-education is going to be one of the major challenges in the forthcoming years. Especially in Western countries, you have a shrinking workforce. At the same time, the digitization of society is ongoing, which means that you not only need cybersecurity professionals, but you need cybersecurity awareness among all workforce. And in order to address this upcoming shortage, which is being acknowledged both by governments as by companies nowadays, given the many initiatives on this particular topic, it really should be addressed at all levels, starting at elementary school, at high school, and at university level, of course. This needs to be, it needs to be a given within the whole education spectrum to address cybersecurity, to address cybersecurity awareness, I would say.
Great point, Wouter. I mean, kids nowadays, elementary and middle school, are developing apps that can be sold and makes a lot of money and so on. Why shouldn't they be getting some awareness around security? It's a great point. Sasha, both head of IT as well as security, you heard on the previous panel, it's not just about data. There's connected systems being developed and so on and so forth. Can you share your thoughts as we think about WEF and the theme today, the fourth industrial revolution, digital transformation? What would you share from that perspective?
Well, from that perspective, I would share. I mean, we just went through with our company through this entire digital transformation, and what we just heard from the previous panel, what is really missed is, first of all, awareness, of course. And you realize that when you build a product or you do connected systems, that you need security by design. I mean, this is for sure. So you really need this baseline to have implemented. But then, you have the business challenge, because, it needs to be done quickly. There is no budget for it. It's a showstopper, So this is really what makes here, I think, the difference. But in the end, as we heard it here and the other panel and last year as well here, it's awareness, awareness, awareness. But there is no good system. For smaller companies, yes, it's like when you have 1,000-2,000 employees, you can do a targeted campaign just for your business. But if you enter the enterprise level and you have thousands of users worldwide, e-learning or some sessions and that's it, but this is not awareness. This is from an industry point of view. And I think from the school systems and everything, you also need to push this awareness quite on a young age. But then, there's a huge gap, and I think it's really, most education are focusing on technical stuff. Yeah. If the technical is not working, you switch to information security, InfoSec, that's it. But the human factor is not taught, not at all. If you look on the trainings out there, it's always missed. The human factor is quite often missed, but it's always one of the biggest risks you have. So I think this is something, we have to think about.
Sasha, let's start back on your end. I have a question for you. You have 3 folks here that are also teaching in the university system. You have a dean, you have definitely the law school space as well. What is missing for you as head of IT as you're looking at your workforce? What are universities doing well maybe and not doing well?
Sure. I think that's a very good question, but I have a perfect example. First of all, what Nasir said is the war of talents. Yeah. First of all, if you want to hire a guy for my team, for example, I have to pay fortune, for his salary. This is one thing. So if you don't have the budget for that, what you do, you take the young people from your teams, which maybe did the apprenticeship, you push them, you give them the education, the training. What is from my perspective missed is this entire ecosystem. So you have a young guy, 20 years old, very, very talented. You give him new tools, new challenges which blow up your mind, and he does it in 2 hours. So definitely he's a talent. Okay, so what is the education you give him? So you send him to a TISP training. Yeah, and I did that, and he came back last week, and he said to me, I said to him, you have to do now the certification. He said, no, but then I have to do it every 3 years, and it's, if I don't do it, he said he wants to do other things, and so this entire system, which you actually have in the medical system, you have to do. You need to pressurize, you need to go, you have theoretical things, you need updates, it's an entire ecosystem which pushes, this is completely missed from my point of view. So I have now this talented 20 years old guy, which is really full of energy, just what do we do? What is the right path for him to grow and, become a senior level,
And so the challenge is you're saying that a career path.
Yes.
And I would love, Alan and Nasir to comment on this. But so a career path.
Yes.
But also, it's not a point in time. The individual needs to continuously learn.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Because digital transformation. Look at some of our audience here. Who had known about 4 years ago about blockchain
Yes,
or a connected car more than 6 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Alan, any thoughts on that point from Sasha?
No, I think that's right. I think that there has to be some way that we think about. Obviously, there's a lot of thought being given to what is the professional progression for a cybersecurity professional. What types of certifications, what type of coursework, at what level. I think that we need to think in the 2 dimensions about that's great, kind of a vertical path. How do we get that person horizontal awareness so that there's often not often, but sometimes the complaint that you can't always bring the CISO or the CIO into the board discussion because they don't see the business perspective. Some CISOs and CIOs are excellent at that, and some struggle with that. Similarly, the general counsels are notoriously terrible for understanding any aspect of the business outside of the legal and regulatory concerns. How do we make sure that that person understands, that he or she really understands the operational prerogatives? One of the ways, of course, that we do that in government and in industry is by just subjecting people to a tabletop exercise. Force people to come around a table and put out a scenario and say, look, how would you respond to this? It only takes 5, 10, 30 minutes before people start stammering about, well, we'd figure that out, or I think we have a protocol for that. So I think that there needs to be more of a culture of, from a horizontal perspective, putting people in the room together with one another to understand exactly how they would react in a particular situation. That helps draw out a level of awareness. But we need to progress past that to a place where your professional education needs to include the foundations of that, so that when you're in that type of situation, you're working from an intermediate or an advanced level. You're not getting the basics then.
Wonderful, Alan. And Nasser, this is very timely because obviously we have built a class just for the law school, which kicks off actually this week. Can you comment on both the foundational setup as far as making sure our students from middle school, high school onwards need to have some foundational skills, but then at a university level, broad and having broad students, whether it's IT, security, business school folks, engineering folks, law school folks, how can they provide value in this space and learn more continuously?
Right, so at NYU for a long time we've realized that security is not just purely a technical problem, right? It's more than that. It's a policy problem, it's a business problem, it's a human behavior problem. So there are many things that we do. So for example, there's a joint program with the law school. Students come in, they take classes from the law school, they take classes from the engineering school, MJ teaches them engineering, and there's a general counsel teaching them law, right? And the students who get out of it now hopefully are folks who can talk to the board, right? When the time comes. Also, considering the fact that it's broader than simply technology, typical cybersecurity programs require you to have a computer science undergraduate or a strong computer science background before you start doing cybersecurity sort of courses. But there's really, that's really not necessary, right? So, for example, at NYU we have something called a bridge program, Bridge to Cybersecurity, whereby you come on in, right? And quickly, in a matter of 4 months or so, you could be from English, you could be from psychology, you could be from any background. You get sufficient knowledge, background knowledge, so now you're able to move into a cybersecurity degree, right? The third thing about the earlier question, the foundational. Yeah. So I think cybersecurity has to be taught to everyone, right? It's just like we teach safety and reliability to every engineer, whether they are chemical engineers or in engineering itself, we should be teaching cybersecurity to everyone. Right in the first programming class, we should be teaching how to write secure code. And more than that, right? We should be teaching cybersecurity across the school. I mean, there is this big initiative in the US about CS for all. The social scientists need to learn computer science. The business folks need to know computer science. Well, all of them also need to know cybersecurity. And we've not sort of reached that, the cybersecurity for all. And finally, as far as the model goes, right, the certifications and whether we are doing enough, I think as in academia, the current model we have is very transactional. You come on in, you give me $50,000. After 2 years, I give you a piece of paper, which is a master's degree, and bye-bye, it's done, right? I think we should change that because learning doesn't end with the acquisition of a credential, especially in technology, especially in cybersecurity. So we should create models which are subscription-like models, which are relationship-based models. So imagine you come on in, and there is a collection of learning experiences available, some few weeks, some maybe longer, some few days, and you take them as you need them. As your career is progressing, maybe tomorrow, 10 years later, you might need to learn something about law or something about blockchains, and you take them as you need, and then you string them along to then get degrees and certificates and things of that sort. And actually, the New York City governor has recently, the mayor has recently funded an initiative that I'm leading, which tries to build out something of that sort. Right? In a small way, because it's very hard to change academia. This is a big change for academia, but at least the first steps of it.
Nasser, thank you. That's some great comments, and actually aligns well with what Oren was mentioning as well. Security, business, and he mentioned at the very end safety issues, and skill sets are different and changing. Wouter, I haven't forgotten about you. I wanted these guys to go first, but I wanted to get your thoughts on what you just heard. And now, how do you make sure you think about partnerships and going to market? Yeah. And whether it's funding, more funding, more focused programs, more different types of models that are focused on, educating the workforce?
Right. Well, I think there are several elements to this. If you look at to my organization, Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, we have members. We have 75 members. Most of them are countries. We have intergovernmental organizations. We have international organizations, and we have private companies. Besides that, we have a set of knowledge and implementing partners, so academia, think tanks, etc. And we have several pillars which we work on, so cybercrime, CERT, CIP, national cybersecurity strategies. But one important one is on education, and we call it the working group on cybersecurity skills and education. In this working group, we act as an umbrella framework for trying to adopt the many different and good working initiatives which are out there, presented by many different stakeholders. And there are a lot of them. So for example, you have the private companies who have their own programs, such as Cisco with their networking academy. Palo Alto is doing a lot of stuff. Microsoft is doing a lot of stuff. You have UN organizations like UNODC and even ITU who have their programs, their academia, and then you have their national initiatives. And I would think within this working group we currently have, one of the most promising one is an initiative by US government. It's called the NICE framework, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. This framework is being implemented already, I believe, by Homeland Security in the US, but it is at the current moment also being adopted by several other nations. And that is interesting, that they are working with this particular framework. So for example, Australia, Canada, and Japan are already using this framework as a base and trying to adjust this according to their own national and cultural needs. So this could be a very good example to be implemented more globally. But besides this, I would say bringing together existing initiatives, whether it is from private companies or from governments, bringing those together to learn from each other is really the most efficient way forward, I would say. Because I would think it's almost impossible to develop some curricula as a global standard or something and to implement it in all nations or in all companies. You have to each have their own perspective, and you have to learn from that and use the good elements within each program, and trying to use that for your own particular needs, whether it's within a company, a nation, or a region.
Okay, great points. You mentioned national, cultural, certainly building it, towards your needs of your country and so on. Now, I'm going to bring in diversity, right? Diversity into the topic here, and look at it from a global perspective. Again, great platform. And unless I misheard the previous panel, or unless somebody's arguing in this room, cybersecurity will be a challenge for some time to come. That means there is a demand there, and the capacity is not being addressed. So the capacity is fulfilled by students, universities, and so on and so forth, and of course continuously educating the workforce. But what about diversity? I would like to hear from the panelists, just to hear from, why is this the issue, of course, maybe some comments on that, but what could we do to try and address this issue as we move forward? You hear about girls who code, minorities are getting into the space. I was at a panel earlier in the morning talking about financial crime, where education is a big gap, and we need to focus on that, and so on and so forth. So I would love to start with that. Maybe Sasha, if you can comment on that, and again, why do you think this is a challenge right now, and what could we do?
Sure. I think why is it a challenge? I mean, The challenge is because it's not globally standardized. That's why we're here. It's the topic of the panel. I know the NICE framework. I think this is a good approach, to be honest, to spread that globally. But you have that, what we also heard from Germany in the previous panel. Everyone is doing something. And for example, the UK, I know they established an excellence and center of excellence in 14 different universities, which they use for researchers and everything. But in the end of all these different initiatives, it ends up that we teach them knowledge, skills, and ability, And I think this is something that maybe should be standardized across all programs in order to have a global approach on this. However you want to call it, then you can call it in a local, whatever is needed. But in fact, what we need is a baseline of different knowledge, skills, and ability. But also, trainings are missed completely that are problem solving, analytical training. Because what they do is to teach you for some problems and you come out to the real world and then you don't know how to solve the problem, And I think these are extra things we need to solve.
And just to follow up on that, so when you think about STEM and STEAM and, definitely the focus on bringing arts into the picture because it helps with looking at this from a diverse sort of a background and focus. There are obviously this panel. Next year I would love to see, a couple of women on this panel as well. And that can talk on this topic. But when you think about middle schoolers, high schoolers, at NYU they do a Capture the Flag event where we bring in high school students to participate in that event, and you're seeing a lot more women come into that picture. Any thoughts in terms of the workforce? What could we do to bring more women and minorities into the space, perhaps? Anyone? Walter? Yeah?
Sure. Well, I think it's already an ongoing process at the moment. Simply given the fact that that there is a workforce shortage, and so it's not only good if more women get into cybersecurity because it's an exciting job, and it's being considered by women as an exciting job. But also simply given the fact that they are hardly needed for society and for industry. So that shows, given that many large companies are setting up programs starting at the young, for kids at a young age. IBM is doing a lot on that. Tomorrow there is a launch by the European Cybersecurity Organization, which is an implementing organization for the European Union. They are launching a Women for Cyber initiative. So it is being acknowledged both by governments as by companies. But it is a challenge to make it fancy, so to speak, and interesting for women. But I think it's already ongoing. If you look at if you're looking at high schools and universities, much more women are getting involved in this, and this is a very good development.
Introduce it at an early age. And before I get to Alan, just again, think of a couple of questions, folks. We may have time for 2 to 3 questions, so we'd love to get your questions there. Alan.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that as different industries have struggled with this issue, there are some structural challenges, and then there's some human challenges. Structurally, it's interesting, where did cybersecurity talent come from? Oren is a good example, coming from the military, or coming up from an interest in playing around with computers. These have been historically male things. And so breaking apart some of that, I think helps. Likewise, you talked at the beginning about elite universities and making it easier, pushing down that into community colleges, in the United States, things like historically black college and colleges and universities, places where you're likely to find more diverse talent pool, help with those structural issues. But I think what's super important is the sergeant level problem. Mentors. You have to have people who can show the way and who can mentor. And it doesn't have to be people of the same minority group, but it has to be people who want to help people, see people succeed. So that's number one. And then the second is to recognize the different ways that people come into things. I was fascinated. My daughter, who is a freshman in high school, had always resisted anything involving coding. never wanted to touch Minecraft, never wanted to do anything of that nature. But a couple of her friends encouraged her to do a computer science class with them this year, and she loves it. And she loves the coding, and she loves the subjects, and it's a mix of technical and non-technical. So we also have to recognize that all people, feel more comfortable doing things together and feel more comfortable being invited into things. Most people, some people like to do things alone, but I think helping that mentorship side and helping to create the more social and more inviting aspects into this industry are critically important as well.
That's great. Awareness is important, and security is not just penetration testing, right? There's a lot more to it.
Right, that's an important part, because I've been running summer camps for high school girls, after school clubs for women in high schools in New York City. I've been running them for quite some time, and there's a lot happening. The number of women is increasing, and there are others, not just me. The government is funding these initiatives. Less so with African Americans and other minorities, right? So when I've run these large competitions for high school students and undergrads, we've done focus studies and groups and things like that. And one of the things I think with some inner city schools, etc., is they just don't even have the computer equipment to play around, right? And to sort of poke around and learn these things on their own, and the schools are not teaching them that, right? So there's a lack of teachers and a lack of curriculum, which sort of gets them engaged with that. And also, as far as women goes, there's another interesting twist to cybersecurity that we discovered. I've written a couple of papers about it. Is that women don't like to break things, right? Hack things, so when you tell them that cybersecurity is more about protecting and sort of catching the bad guys, that sort of attracts them more. The second thing also is that stereotype of cybersecurity is a lone man sort of thing, or a lone person thing. You're sitting in a basement like reverse engineering or trying to hack in somewhere or something of that sort. No, it's a team effort. It's a very collaborative sort of career, a career where you work in teams, and making them understand this and have real models, women who come in and speak to them on a regular basis, understand this, I think addresses that issue to some extent. Yes.
Some great points, guys. We may have some time. We have some time for 1 to 2 questions. Any questions? Please.
Tom Patterson, Chief Trust Officer at Unisys. I love that there is the panel on education. Love what you said. Just wanted to ask you to maybe highlight more on the youngest level of education. I still see a lot of programs that start in high school, and high school's good. It's better than college and grad school. We're making progress. But where I've gotten involved in different cities around the U.S., we started at age 6, and we start with Scratch, which is a wonderful coding program, free of charge, no barrier to entry at all. And we have 6-year-olds that go through Scratch and are coding Python at 6. There is no barrier that I've seen. And to your point, the most disadvantaged parts of town tends to be where I like to start. Tablets cost $35 now. Internet Wi-Fi is available now. The barriers to entry of needing all this equipment, everything can be done in the cloud now. I think for the cost of a lunch here, couldn't we really get in and make that change? Davos is about change and really making action. Could you comment a little bit about getting past the barriers and go even further?
Well, I think it's interesting. Will.i.am from the Black Eyed Peas, right? He talks a lot about this. He has a program in Los Angeles that started to try to get kids into robotics. But he emphasized, in addition to getting the equipment and the people, he emphasized that you have to look at the dynamics, the social dynamics of the environment. What are people looking for? At that age, at an elementary school, middle school, people are looking socially to belong to things. People are looking for social experiences, and unfortunately, as he pointed out, in places like inner city Los Angeles and elsewhere, people join gangs. So he kind of looked at that model and said, well, look, the gangs go recruiting kids at around 10, so we're going to try to catch them at about 8. But we're going to mimic some of the same things, which is this is a community. This is it's not just you programming in Scratch or you building an elementary robotics. This is a thing that you do. And so I think that all of the points, Tom, that you made are excellent, and I think it should be married with that sense of kids, what do kids at that age want to do? How do you make it broader than just the kids who might be otherwise disposed to playing around with robotics or programming, and make it part of the social or competitive environment that the kids operate in anyway?
Please, one last question. Go ahead.
So I wanted to follow on from that because I think it's a really fundamental point. The thing we've done in the UK Python conference this year for the very first time, we have an initiative where we buy kit and we give kit, and that's been, you know, the Raspberry Pi Foundation has been amazing to get the skill of Python. And yeah, you're right about Scratch. I've got young people as young as 4 coding in Python who can't be doing with that entry level. And I think, you know, we misunderstand their ambition. But what we did this year was very different. In terms of actually funding our places at the conference, we funded ours +1. And so we ran, alongside the 3-day conference, a conference of 4 to 14-year-olds. Why was that important? They loved that the cream of the Python industry was right with them. They were coding alongside their heroes. And actually, their heroes, a lot of our community is way under 30. And so they're just a little bit further than them. Okay, 10 years, but a little bit further than them. That's actually inspirational in a whole different way. So from a tech industry point of view in the UK, we're saying it's actually down to us. And we're part of that future workforce provision, and we have to make it happen. So we're, you know, enroll one, pay for one.
Fantastic, and great points around the opportunity for, there are a lot of big companies in this room and watching us as well, great opportunities for partnership between private and public to help address this. Well, last comments, maybe a quick 20 seconds from each of you. Maybe we'll start at the end, Sasha?
Yes, yeah, I think it's when you hear from private or from the academic sector, I think we have to do something. It needs to start very, very soon, but first we need to align.
Okay, thank you. Wouter?
Yes, public-private partnerships, international cooperation, learning from each other, that's really the key and the starting point.
Thank you. Alan?
One of the things that we do in one of our signature classes at Georgetown Law is we teach students the background in cyber and incident management and national security, and then we put them into a scenario. And they come out, and not only did they learn something, but it was fun and it was exciting and it was a team effort. So let's bring in those aspects to this education.
Great point. Let's not just keep it to corporations, right? Yeah.
And there needs to be better cooperation between academia and industry to design learning experiences. Right now there is a gap between the two, and so we need to find ways to sort of develop programs jointly with industry and academia.
Well, folks, thank you. This was a wonderful panel. Appreciate everyone providing their thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to start the next session here. So good afternoon. Cyber risk is definitely not new, and neither are the tensions that government, businesses, and the regulators also are trying to challenge themselves with, kind of coming up with a common framework to manage risk and measure risk and quantify risk. Obviously, we've talked about already today in the other panels, IoT. Cloud has not been mentioned, but obviously the risks of cloud and also third parties, and also the compounded challenge, really the cybersecurity labor epidemic that we're having is really causing a lot of challenges with really how do you manage risk with the evolving digital era and thriving digital era that we are in. So to that end, we really want to challenge ourselves to come up with strategies around risk management. And so we've assembled a esteemed and knowledgeable panel today. So I'll introduce them real quick, and then I'll ask them to provide a quick opening comment, and we'll get started. So to my left, I've got Andrea Baumer-Blanc. She is the CEO of GEC Advisory. Risk Advisory. I've got Norma Kramer, who is she is the chair of the cybersecurity policy regulatory team at Holland & Knight. I've got David Stennard, who is the CSO of M&T Bank out of New York. And then we have Oliver Wamel, who is the CISO of Bank of Vontobel. Vontobel, yes. All right, so real quick, just a quick opening statement around cyber risk and some best practices that you've seen be applied in your experiences.
So good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. Thank you, Val and the Cyber Future Foundation. So my background is, I started as a lawyer, and then I moved into being a general counsel, head of different areas within 4 different companies in 4 different sectors, including information security, environmental health and safety, business ethics and compliance, and risk management. And for the last 6 years, I've been doing this from a consultant standpoint with strategic risk advice to companies, businesses, governments, and nonprofits. And so I specialize in talking to them about their most important strategic risks. And of course, cyber is one of the top 5, if not one of the top 3 or 1 or 2 of many companies. So where I sort of train my focus is on the board level governance, risk governance, strategic risk governance. And so I did a large research study for the conference board a few years ago on emerging cyber risk governance best practices and trends. And so out of that study, I learned 10 takeaways from a governance and a senior executive standpoint on how, organizations optimally can handle this issue, starting at the very top with the board and the CEO. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll talk more later.
Good, Norma.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to start by saying I do like to break things and then hopefully put them back together again. So I have harnessed what was a long career in the government. We're focusing on international trade issues, critical infrastructure issues, and really what systemic risk means to all of those. Looking at the continuity of operations and planning and what we call continuity of government, and then taking really those best practices and experience into the private sector and helping them understand what does systemic risk really look like. And a lot of times that really means that I'm talking to the chief technology officer, the CISO, the chief risk officer, and then sort of working my way back up to also be that translator. But I also come from a regulatory world. And when we look at what a global regulatory structure means for cybersecurity, a lot of times what I'm trying to help clients understand is where is that risk coming from? How should you try and manage that risk? And when you think about, I think what is an evolving awareness that companies are expected to manage a certain level of cybersecurity risk, but wherever that line is, above that is a nation state or a catastrophic attack, trying to parse through what are appropriate roles between business and really the governments around the world. So I'll stop there, but I have enjoyed working across all of the sectors, and there are also a lot of lessons learned that you can help share with that.
Great insight, thank you. David?
Good afternoon, David Stender. I have a little bit more of an unusual background. Almost all of my cybersecurity experience is operational, more than 35 years in military, national security agency, federal government executive branch, and then in private industry and financial services. I think we have done ourselves a great disservice in how we deal with the cybersecurity risk or cyber risk problem. We've put a bunch of folks in charge of it who have no understanding of risk, of what risk is. I think we put quite a few folks in who are maybe strong general technical cybersecurity folks, but don't even have an understanding of the business they support. I can't tell you how many cybersecurity people I talk to that say, what do you do for a living? I am a XYZ cybersecurity person. And so, well, what's your company actually do? And they don't realize that they are a support function for whatever that is. I think we've done a lot of bad with that. We have to really recognize that cyber risk is sort of in its infancy. It has been growing over the past 20 or 30 years. But if you look, for example, from a financial services perspective, we have hundreds of years of data on what makes risky loan. We have 20, 30 years on what starts to make something a cyber risk. And we're trying to put those things together as if they're in the same category. And that, I think that's been the wrong approach.
Very good. Oliver, any opening
Thank you for
thoughts?
the introduction. So I do not have add any more about cyber risk and financial services, but my name is Oliver. I'm working from Bank Vontobel, which is a really tiny Swiss bank, but we have offices all over the world. So we also have cyber risks, which we should take into care about. In the opening session, Hans Wilhelm said that the energy suppliers all have to be ISO 27 certification. I guess this is a wrong approach because you have to not having a control-based approach, you have to have a risk-based approach because otherwise you have the certification, but you are... That's a law, I know. In Switzerland, on the financial sector, it's the same law, but it's a wrong approach, I guess. Yeah. So from my side of view, it's better you have to find the so-called passage obligé. It's the required passage where a cyber risk going through or is passing through. And if you find this spot, you can manage your cyber risks.
So these are great opening statements. I appreciate your thoughts. It's interesting, you know, as cybersecurity has become more of a business issue and cybersecurity leaders have been developed from different pieces of the organization, maybe through audit, through consulting, through coming in from government. Only 9% of CISOs actually have a business background, which I find very, very an issue, right, as it becomes more of an issue. How, from your experiences, what are the executive or board level metrics in communication? What does that look like? And are there some key metrics that have been very successful in kind of communicating how the program is doing and how you measure risk within the organization that the boards and executives understand versus maybe somebody with a non-business background would struggle with? And to me, it's a big challenge, obviously, in our industry, is to kind of communicate what we're trying to do and trying to move the agenda forward within their organizations. So any thoughts on that from, you want to start? All right, very good.
I do everything sort of at the board or the executive level, and I think it has to start with the CEO and the executive team taking ownership of this issue through a very robust enterprise risk management program in the first place. Now, many companies, even some of the bigger ones, don't have a robust enterprise risk management program in place in the first place. So that's a challenge, especially with a risk as strategically and existentially large as cyber. So if you don't have the enterprise risk management, start with that. Have somebody who knows how to do that. But then I think the most important thing in order to do the metrics at the end of the day is to get the Chief Information Security Officer and other key players, CRO, maybe General Counsel, to be working in an interdisciplinary way so that they can see all the different angles, the 360 on the issues affecting their particular organization, so that they can then go to the crown jewels, understand the different sort of stakeholders and actors, threat actors, and then design a dashboard that's relevant to their organization, that's relevant to their business people, to their business, and that can then be translated into a dashboard that's basically in front of the board on a quarterly basis with metrics that make sense for that organization, that are predictable in the sense of we're going to see this, this, and the other thing, and you bring the right people up to the board and the executive team to explain these things, but the simpler the better, the more uncomplicated the better, because the higher you go up in the organization, believe it or not, there's much less knowledge of this kind of technical detail. So you have to be able to translate that all up into metrics that are understandable to people who are over 60, are mostly financial experts and CEOs who sit on the boards and don't really understand this stuff. And until we start having people on boards who really understand these kinds of things, it becomes a real sort of translation and sort of communication challenge. So those are some general things that I would say are important.
Very good. Norma?
You know, one of the things that I have seen when I started my cyber practice in 2005, people said, cyber what? You know, what is that? Data security? Yeah, I've learned a few things. One, when you're trying to talk to the CEO and the board, you have to understand that there are cultures within industries on what risk means. And there is also an evolution and awareness on what cybersecurity is. There are still companies and CEOs and members of the board who just sort of go, that is not my problem. It's the IT, you know, gal or girl's problem. And just tell me how much money you need and you should just go away. And what we're trying to do, and what I spend a lot of time on, is understanding the personality of the CEO and the board. You have to understand really the regulatory and the legal structures, which I know is such a snoozer for those companies, because sometimes when you're talking to the CEO and the board, you have to explain to them what will cyber risk do to your regulatory and your legal requirements. And a lot of them they may never understand pure cyber, but they understand business. And so if you articulate cyber risk as a business imperative, and then you literally deconstruct it for each person. So the CTO, the chief risk officer, you have to talk about it in a very different way with almost everyone on the board until they at least get to maybe a level playing field of understanding. And really the last piece for me is to try and explain to the CEO and the board, it's not as if you're going to give them $3 million, $3, $30, and then you're done. Right? The point ultimately is, as we've added technological innovation, you can't have that innovation without cybersecurity risk. But if you manage your risk, you can actually harness that together and see great benefits. But if you want to move forward in our industrial revolution and the impacts of globalization, you have to understand that. So it takes time to deconstruct it in a way that they understand.
Very good. David?
So that was actually sort of my point earlier on, where we try to talk to the boards as if they're little children, or we try to talk to them as if they are PhD crypto mathematicians, and we don't have a good way to go in between. When you look at how most of these boards are, and these are all smart men and women, right? They are, you know, maybe they're a little bit older, but they didn't get to where they were by being stupid. You walk out of a cybersecurity presentation for these folks where they may be shaking their head as if they didn't understand anything, and they will go into a set of P&L tables right after that are so complex that your eyes will bleed, right? So it's not like they can't understand complex things, but it's not their area of expertise. So you have to put it in terms that are understandable. Again, I think one of the biggest problems where we fail from a cybersecurity perspective in terms of risk is not putting the risk in terms that matter to that particular business. If you work for a bank, put it in banking terms. As an example, I mentioned to our board one time, and if you ever want to get your board riled up, you should do this, that we were spending too much money on cybersecurity because our cybersecurity risk was sort of here, and the amount of money we were spending was over here. And it didn't make sense to spend $20 to save $10, right? They very much understood that. I don't think they'd ever heard that before, and they were a little surprised that I said it, but they were very willing to discuss it then because that made sense to them. The other thing that I thought was really important was when you go to them with metrics, make it a metric that they can understand. No one wants to hear you talk about how 1.437% of your IPs might be compromised, because no one even knows what that means. Is that good or bad? Because it could be good. You know, maybe it's cheaper to have that mini compromise. Tell them, are things sort of thumb up? Are they sort of, you know, status quo? Or are they thumbs down? That's a pretty straightforward metric that most folks can understand from a business perspective. This is going to cost me money. I'm okay with my current investment, or I'm spending too much. Right? If you can talk in terms like that, they will really start to take on cyber risk, I think, in a better way.
Oliver, any comments? Thank you, David.
Yes, thanks. As you said, the management of banks are very aware about risk, so you do not have to tell them how to manage risks. But if you get known which root causes that led or are leading to cyber risk or information risk, and then you can translate this to, for instance, some scenarios they are understandable for the management, then you are able to describe which risk we have and which cyber measures we have to take in place to reduce or this risk, or which residual risks we have to manage by insurances, for instance.
So one thing I think we've all probably seen is how do you, there are some boards that are enlightened, right? But how do they get there? Maybe it's by industry, maybe it's by background, but how do you go create an enlightened environment or a cyber savvy board or executive team when it doesn't exist at the moment? Any thoughts around how do you bring risk management terms and strategies into kind of building a kind of a risk culture, a risk management culture that's savvier than it was at the current time? Andre, you want to make comments?
Sure. So I think, for me, this goes back to the culture that the leadership brings to the organization, and by leadership I mean both the executive team, CEO, and the board. And one of the things, I'll use an anecdote. The last company in which I was an executive before I started my own business, I was in charge of audit, compliance, risk, and corporate responsibility, and then they said, here, take information security. It was a technology company, it was under $1 billion, just under $1 billion in revenues, very aggressive, very decentralized, but with one division that was military intelligence. So it was kind of a very confusing environment. And they had also had, they were publicly traded and also had a problem. So they had gone dark and come back. So one of the things that they needed was an information security philosophy, which they did not have. And so when they threw the InfoSec team into my group, I spent about 6 months trying to just understand what the InfoSec guy was telling me, because I'm a lawyer by training, not a technologist. And so it was very painful, but it led to a discovery through this whole process that what we really needed to do is engage the CEO, engage a couple of key business leaders in the organization, and engage a few experts, technical and other experts, to be part of a team that then found or decided what is the philosophy of information security for our organization. How are we going to go? So it's a philosophy, but it has to be an actionable, I also like to use the word culture, where specific decisions are made and steps are taken, and you understand what you need to protect and where you put your resources and what kind of an interdisciplinary team you need, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it's all about getting to that philosophy and then making it actionable. And that, of course, you have to engage the board as well in understanding all that. So that's kind of what I think is one way to do it, and every organization should be doing it.
David or Oliver, any comments on that as far as building a kind of a culture that is more savvy from a risk management and cyber perspective?
I would say a huge part of that is that conversational aspect, right? For example, when I got to my current position at M&T Bank, our Chief Information Security Officer, or the guy who called himself the Chief Information Security Officer, because his boss didn't even know that that's what his title was, spoke to the board once a year for 2 minutes, right? Last year, I think I was in front of my board 19 times, and I probably spent, on average, about 2 hours each time talking to him. And as a matter of fact, I recruited a member, our CEO asked me to help out. I recruited a member who is a specific cybersecurity expert from federal government to come on to the board. Now, that was not to become the sole person on the board. It was really to act as a champion for things like cybersecurity outside of me saying it, right? Because a big part of that is they want to trust me, they trust me with what I'm doing, but they have a fiduciary responsibility that they have to follow, and it helps them if they have someone there who, when they have their own private discussions, can talk to them and put it in terms that they completely understand, right? And that was very helpful, I think.
So I'm very glad to say that our management of board or senior management are very aware about IT and cybersecurity and cyber risks due to the fact that we are, as I said before, very well regulated in Switzerland, so they have to be aware. And therefore, awareness is not a big deal for me to go to the member of board, to the senior management, even to the employees, doing some awareness campaigns. We've got the money, I've got the task to do this all the time.
So just a couple of thoughts. When we think about trying to explain that risk, it really is about focusing in again about the bottom line, right? So if it's about availability and integrity of whatever it is that you are delivering, are you delivering power? Are you helping patients? Do you have medical devices? Are you providing communication services? What is that thing that you do in order to make money, and why do you care about that? And then apply cyber risk into that environment. Again, you have to make it clear where the risk is, what it will do, and ultimately what the bottom line is to the company. If you run an investor-owned utility and the power goes down, you have a cyber physical incident, and it's not coming back up for 6 months, what's going to happen to your stock? And I do that across all sectors because they still have to run a business. That's one. Two is really explaining to boards and the CEO what I'm going to call traditional cyber risk now, which is horrible to say. And the second is really what I'm going to call geopolitical risk. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a US company, a global company, it doesn't matter. If wherever you are seeing conflict with other countries, and we know who they are, we don't have to name them today, then all of my clients see an immediate uptick in cybersecurity attacks the minute that the US decides to issue trade sanctions against a country. So trying to explain to companies where they fit in the universe is a little bit harder. And then really my third point is you're no longer just a company that is a bank that provides energy or water, at least in the US and around the world. You are providing services to the defense industrial base. And so we are starting to use the term defense critical infrastructure. And in the US, we're seeing a much more focused approach, whether it's from a policy approach or even a regulatory approach, because there is a view that those services are so essential to our military and our national security operations that there is a higher level of expectation. Now, after I say that to a CEO and a board, and there's a little bit of glazing over, and then I might have to bring in some other experts, you just have to understand where you sit depends on where you stand, and who are you servicing, and that's a much harder issue.
I know you've got another comment, but it is very interesting that at Coalfire, where I work, we urge the CISO to think like a CEO, and they've got to know the business and the revenue streams just like the CEO would. And so I definitely agree with your comments there on that.
Building on what Norma's just said, and you too, I think there's two other sort of hooks, if you want to call them that are really important when you're thinking about the board and the executive management. One is this concept of reputation risk, which has become much more pervasive in the financial industry, certainly, but also in other parts of the industry and sectors. And cyber risk, to me, to paraphrase The Economist when they came out 10 years ago with a study about reputation risk, calling it the risk of risks, I consider cyber reputation risk the risk of risks turbocharged, which is really as hard and as potentially damaging to your bottom line and your reputation as any risk if you're found unaware or unprepared and that sort of thing. On the other side of that equation, I think there's something to appeal. So that appeals to talking about these issues as a risk, as a reputation risk, is much more, you can capture the attention of your high-level executives. On the other side of the coin, the positive one is if you're talking about, if you understand your cyber risk and you create the resilience, you're actually creating opportunity for value creation, not only in terms of less liability and less stakeholder dissatisfaction, but also in terms of creating new products and services. And the conference board research report that I did, I looked at 5 companies that are anonymous, but they're very well known. And one of them was a big technology company that had its cyber risk governance and everything else very well developed. And they were creating new products on top of that. So they were making it a part of their business offering. So I think that's a really important piece of this puzzle.
So as we look at and talk more about cyber risk, how do we balance regulatory requirements, which there's a lot of audit fatigue going out there, and making sure that we have our risk registry and we address that, and also all of your compliance, very specific compliance requirements. How do we balance that with also really just understanding the business and measuring risk and looking at risk management and just applying those principles and guidelines versus the competitiveness of making sure that we are PCI compliant or compliant with GDPR, et cetera. Any thoughts on how do you balance that within organizations?
Go ahead. Do you want it? A couple of quick things. One, having, I think, been a regulator and spending a lot of time with companies, it's a little bit easier to talk to both the companies about what managing risk means and dealing with regulations. But also, I think it's imperative for companies to understand that regulators around the world, look, the bottom line is they're in charge. They have the bully pulpit, and it's incumbent upon us in the private sector to work with them as best we can to get them to understand not just that we understand the risk, we understand and respect their roles. Now, most regulators theoretically care about the output. So what we don't want is sort of prescriptive regulations that tell us how to do something. What we want is outcome-focused regulations to achieve a goal. And having been on the inside and out, it's a much easier conversation to say, here are best practices, here are ways that we can do it. We know you're going to write a regulation. Here are 3 options for you to consider. And here's where we've seen that they've worked in other industries and where they haven't. And if you give the regulator a great idea, that's fantastic. If you get a regulation you help put together, then guess what? Compliance is easier. But if you don't fully participate with the regulators, I guarantee you they're going to come up with something and you may not like it. And if they don't understand really the operational side, again, back to SCADA systems, it's not just the IT side. They're trying to understand where that risk is and what to do with it. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be the most enjoyable experience of your life, but you have to run a business and we need an environment. We're stuck with regulations. We're going to see more, but maybe they can at least be easy to implement and achieve the outcome.
Yeah, I was going to say, to the extent you can, just ignore the regulators, but that's probably not an appropriate comment. We've worked very hard to integrate with them, right? So part of that issue is that first of all, again, I've been in operations most of my adult life. I'm not a big fan of regulatory or compliance-based security systems because if you look at any company that was hit, every one of them was compliant with something, right? And that's not a great indicator. My view, and this is not mine, it's a very common view within cybersecurity, is that if you run a good operational program, the regulatory side and the compliance side will just sort of fall out naturally from that. A big part of that is making sure that you literally are integrated with your audit, risk, and regulatory folks so that when they are talking about things, you're actually trying to get them to take a little bit of ownership in it. And if you can get them to do that, I think the outcome is a lot better. And one thing that I would say is if you can do anything, again, I'll use financial services, for example, as a background. If you can do anything to sort of up the game of the regulators in terms of helping them with getting quality trained folks in, getting folks who are a little more senior, maybe with some more operational experience, so they understand what those regulations are actually doing to the companies, and they're not just coming at it from a theoretical or academic viewpoint, I think you're going to be much better off, and you will reduce your risk because of that.
Amen. I think that's a great approach. Appreciate the insight there, David. Any questions from the audience? Just pause real quick. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have to ask this. So imagine you do a perfect job of understanding your own cyber risk, and then you connect your systems to your suppliers and your customers. How should companies think about what risk, and how do you manage that?
So a couple quick things. One, suppliers, vendors, third parties all need to be part of your ecosystem. Companies tend to use a lot of large, small, and medium-sized companies that provide very good service but may not have cyber risk. So you need to think about mentoring those companies and suppliers. You need to be putting requirements in your contracts with them, and you need to be working within broader structure. So I'm looking at Denise. There are things called ISACs. There are lots of industry groups, so you as a company don't have to take ownership of teaching every one of your own suppliers. Work collaboratively together. One of the things we learned after 9/11, this is on supply chain security, but on the physical side, we noticed that there are a lot of companies were all using the same suppliers. So you can come up with a common audit structure that you want to use with these suppliers. I mean, ultimately, the rising tide lifts all boats, but you don't need the HVAC vendor to be your threat vector. And eventually, we either need to get a lot of these companies up where they need to be, or we need to think about how we're going to change or modify our business structure.
Just to add to that quickly, I think there's, if you have a robust third-party risk management system in place from cradle to grave, bringing them in, managing them, and then terminating them, if you have that, then you can latch on the cyber piece. But if you don't have good third-party management, which a lot of companies don't, then you're kind of out of luck, I think, to have a robust system in place.
Very good. Other questions? Yeah.
Another risk industry, insurance. We've seen the cyber risk insurance market grow dramatically over the last several years. By employing or engaging with insurance from a cyber risk perspective, how does that impact your lack or effective diligence and operational effectiveness and drive on risk and try to eliminate the risk of that safety net catching you in case there's an incident?
Thoughts on that?
I would say it is a double-edged sword. Insurance is an excellent way to help, sort of control the risk, put it within your appropriate risk appetite. But you also put yourself, based on the insurance contract itself, you put yourself into some very specific limitations on what you can and cannot do. And so from an operational response perspective, you have to be prepared for what that means. They may drive how you're going to respond rather than letting your business drive how you're going to respond. So it is a little bit of a double-edged sword. I'm a big fan of cybersecurity insurance. Make sure you know what in the heck you're talking about before you get it, and make sure they know what in the heck they're talking about before you buy it from them.
Just quickly to add to that, I think cyber insurance has now become a ubiquitous term. The majority of insurance right now is data breach insurance. It's not what I would call pure operational insurance. A lot of insurers, and this really is the point, every policy is so incredibly different. Maybe you don't have cyber insurance, but cyber is covered under business continuity. I mean, there are different ways to look at it. There are a number of insurers who actually are providing comprehensive packages, but in order to do that, they are becoming more prescriptive because they have to understand how much risk are they buying with you. And a lot of companies, not all of them, when they get the little checklist from the broker, they just say yes to everything. And what we're starting to see is when there's a cybersecurity attack and those analytics are done on what the company did or didn't do, they didn't do half the things that they said, and the insurance company is not going to cover them. So there's a lot of litigation around that. There's a lot of, I think, changing in awareness as to what that risk management structure means. I think eventually we want a larger pool of real cyber insurance policies, but the insurance industry has caps on the amount of risk that they can insure. And to your point earlier, where we talk about you only have 20 to 30 years of really aggregated data on cybersecurity, how you deconstruct a cybersecurity attack, insurers want analytical data, right? And so we don't have enough of that, and the attacks change so frequently that the underwriters are really trying to understand and evaluate that.
Yeah, you can't really go at this from they sent me a questionnaire and I checked all the yeses or nos or whatever the appropriate check was. I mean, my team spends days every year. We have a team of insurers that come in because we're a big bank. We have a team that helps because no one's going to hold a single policy. And we literally spend days with them going through in minute detail our people, process, and technology, right? Just so that they can fully understand our program. That's actually paid off in spades, right? Insurance is expensive. There's not just cybersecurity insurance, there's general insurance, there's legal insurance, there's all kinds of different insurance you can get. We have used that to actually reduce our insurance costs overall by showing them and integrating them, sort of very similar to the regulator approach, integrating them into the program, letting them see everything. They're much more comfortable, and it's reduced our rates to a point where we can get more insurance for the same amount, or we can reduce our insurance costs.
Just one quick example, because I love this one. I was looking at a cyber insurance policy for a client, which there's nothing better in the world than reading those. And this insurer was very creative, and in the fine print, it actually understood cybersecurity information sharing of cyber threat indicators and defensive measures. And they had in the policy that when the entity shared any information, either with an ISAC or the federal government, that company had to send that same information to the insurer. Now that's very sophisticated, and you don't necessarily want to agree to that. And that's why it's complicated on whether it works or it doesn't.
If I could just make one very brief point.
Very
so,
brief.
Again, following on with that, we actually include our insurers in when we do tabletops and wargaming for that. Because when the real stuff hits the fan, they're going to be there. So you better have integrated them into your response already.
So some quick closing comments, just real quick, 30 seconds. Oliver, you want to, any closing comments or thoughts?
I can approve that the negotiation of cyber risk insurances takes very long time. We had spent more than a year to find the right insurance, which make a policy for us.
David, any closing comments?
Again, I'd just like to emphasize that this really is about business risk. Cybersecurity is just one small part of that. I'd actually say that your legal risk, for example, is much greater than your cybersecurity risk. But you need to understand how you as a cybersecurity professional fit into the business overall and their risk appetite, and not so much how they need to accommodate yours.
Your cyber risk is your business risk is your legal risk. I think it is important that people understand that it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. We're using technology to update, innovate, and to provide better products and services to consumers, but that just means everything needs to include cyber at the front end, right? Security by design, privacy by design, and understand that there is geopolitical and global risk. You have to understand what that means. You need to know who to call when you have a problem, and you have to understand that you have to teach and train every single person in the organization, and that includes your HR just as much as it is your CTO. So I think we're seeing change. In 2005, I said we needed a paradigm shift. Now I think with some, again, our global risks, I think we need a tectonic shift for people to understand, what it is to manage this risk overall.
My final words are 3 words: leadership, culture, and diversity. If you have those going well in your organization, it means that you're going to be doing good risk governance and risk management. That includes cyber. And when I say diversity, I mean at the very top of the organization, your board needs to be either risk savvy and have some risk savvy members on it, including potentially cyber, but other things as well, so that they ask the right questions of management. Leadership is under control, there's a culture, and the diversity of all these different opinions and perspectives get counted in. And then I think cybersecurity management can be improved.
Well, certainly a number of issues we've addressed and talked about, and definitely want to carry forward with the cybersecurity as it relates to cyber risk. So thank you. Just a quick hand and appreciation for the panelists. I look forward to continued discussion.
One quick announcement: at 4:45, we're going to take a class photo with our professionals here. So all who can stick around, we'll do that immediately at the end of the final panel.
Giving me hell about it, just like my phone rang in the middle. They're like, I can't hear some of the questions. So I've been organising trying to get mics done, but people are like, what? Have you got questions? So yeah, very, very responsive out there in the street. Yeah, so, but I do apologise for my phone call. It's like, I'm trying to answer them, and then they're like, where's the mic?
Also, where the real problem is, the cyber adversaries problem, right? And then we talked about attribution in the morning, we talked about resilience, we talked about many different topics which relate to this, but this is happening, you know, there is a real person behind this, whether it's running a botnet or it's, you know, it's cybercrime, is absolutely a physical problem, from connecting the digital to the physical. So the next topic, we have a great set of panelists and really diverse orientation in terms of perspectives. So I'll you know, go by the panelists and let them introduce themselves, and then get on the topic.
Good afternoon.
Good. It should be good.
Oh, good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. Thank you in beautiful Davos. Denise Anderson. I am the president and CEO of the Health ISAC Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and also the chair of the National Council of ISACs. So I work with all of the ISACs on a very close basis daily, practically on these things. And I consider myself an advocate for global information sharing. I was actually employee number 2 at FS-ISAC, the Financial Services ISAC. Was instrumental in building that ISAC to where it is today. You know, I've been doing information sharing for a long time, and I think that when we're talking community, the criminals have a community, and so we need to be, we are our own worst enemy when we don't share and create our own communities for sharing good information with each other. So that's kind of my background there.
Absolutely, go on, Rod.
Thank you. My name is Rod Beckstrom. Started my career in high tech, started my first company in grad school and took it public and sold it. That was in financial risk management. And then wrote a book on decentralization and got recruited by the Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell in the US, to be one of his senior advisors, and I helped to author the Comprehensive National Cyber Initiative of the US government. And then I moved on to run the National Cybersecurity Center, which was a joint venture between Department of Defense, DNI, Secretary of Defense, and Attorney General. I reported all 4 of them and coordinated the NSA, FBI, CIA, and DoD cyber centers in collaboration. So I have a lot of experience in information sharing and what works and doesn't work in collaboration. Then went on to be CEO of ICANN, which is an internet coordination organization, focuses on the domain names and addresses globally and works with countries around the world and has a significant security level. So we implemented DNSSEC at that time. Anyway, so, and back at my Silicon Valley roots, I have a cyber consultancy. I have pieces of a couple of artificial intelligence companies, including one in the cybersecurity space, and just really honored to be here with all of you.
All right, good afternoon, Colonel Yakhtarian. I've spent 24 years in the Estonian Air Force, out of those last 6 as the commander of the Air Force. Now for the last 4 months, I've had the privilege to be the director of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which is a think tank in Tallinn, Estonia. It's not part of NATO military structure. It is based on nations volunteering to be members, contributing with their smartest and best people. So basically anything intelligible that I say today is thanks of their knowledge rubbing off on me, and everything else is my original thought and should not be repeated by anyone.
Hi, my name is Renaud Doazon. I'm CTO and co-founder of Tenable. Tenable is a cyber exposure company. We help our customers identify and reduce the most effectively their cyber exposure. I've been in the cyber industry for over 20 years, before it was called cyber. And to bounce back a little bit on David's comment earlier, one thing I've noticed in the maturation of the industry over the last few years is the emergence of the notion of pragmatism when it comes to security. That industry has really been black or white, very extreme. Things are perfect or they're not. And what we're starting to see is kind of a reflection of, well, sometimes a shade of gray in between.
Thank you. And as I said, this is a pretty diverse panel, so we'd like to tap into the different perspectives of cyber adversaries. Let's start with you, Denise. You've been the whole information sharing, constituency, I would say, has been pioneered by you and your colleagues. So how do you see the whole role of, we talked about attribution a little bit also, so how do you see the role of information sharing, and where do you draw the, you have also drawn boundaries and sometimes erase them, so please share your thoughts around that.
Well, I think it's really important. Obviously, you mentioned earlier that there are people behind these attacks, right? And so understanding that there are tactics, techniques, and procedures and what they're doing to go against various companies, understanding geopolitical risks, as we saw with Petya and WannaCry, not Petya, WannaCry, and understanding that even though you may not be exactly the target, you can be impacted, as we saw in those attacks. And basically being able to share with each other within the community and across communities, because we share not only within our verticals, but also across and globally, understanding what's out there, what we need to protect against, and have a good sense so that if we see something, we know immediately, okay, it's this particular threat actor, these are the typical types of techniques that they'll use in their attacks, and we can look within our infrastructures as to what we should be guarding against or protecting against. So the more that we could share information with each other to understand what we're dealing with will help us, in fact, deal with it.
Rod, you have seen all sides, from the government side as well as from the ICANN side, whereas global cooperation, and then driving that. Where do you see pinpointing adversaries go to, and a little bit in terms of attribution as well as getting identifying the people behind this?
Sure, and I'm going to actually start with a quick case study. I was at DEF CON, it was either Black Hat or DEF CON about 8 years ago, and I was talking to one of the top security researchers in Silicon Valley who was hot on the trail of a criminal network in Eastern Europe and contacted their government counterpart just to let them know, hey, I'm chasing this and I could use some help. And the government counterpart pulled out a little red stamp called top secret, stamped it on the project, and it killed the hunt. Told the person, you'll disengage, you'll not be involved, we have it from here. And it went cold and the criminals got off. And so what I want to talk about really briefly is some of the don'ts of investigation and pursuing cyber criminals. Because in public-private partnerships, each party really has to respect each other's role and maintain the trust. And the don'ts are often ignored. Most of us know what the do's are. So the do's real quickly are think decentralized, think ecosystem, think networks and partnerships. Don't think top-down hierarchy or control. It's got to be flat, very decentralized, self-organizing, like this event here today that you're contributing to. Start relationships before you need them. Invest more in forensic and investigative capabilities is essential for tracking cyber crimes. And focus on effective partnerships, which means this trust. It's very, very delicate in intense investigations. You don't want to... You don't want to get too many parties involved, but you've got to have international collaboration often to have success. And you got to foster peer-to-peer relationships. Don'ts, very quickly, do not build information sharing platforms unless they're missing. Health ISAC, FS ISAC are great examples. There's the DHS platforms. Each governments have their own platform. NATO may have its own platform, but only create a new platform if they're missing. And I say this because so often when we talk about public-private partnerships, somebody talks about building a new platform. And most of those are just a complete waste of time and resources, and I'd say over 90% of the time. So just don't do it unless it's missing. Try to use existing platforms if you can. Secondly, just don't violate the private sector's trust. And don't play it asymmetrical. The private sector often feels that governments are a one-way information suck. And I've been on both sides. I mean, I'm in the private sector now, and I've worked in the government. And so the government's got to be really a fair party in the transaction. And then the last thing is never try to force information sharing. Parties know what they can share. They have an interest in sharing with the right parties at the right time to accomplish their goals. If you want to be in that information sharing flow, you better be contributing something to the network and the other parties, but never try to compel it or force it as a government or as a hierarchical authority, unless it's an absolute crisis, and that's a different discussion.
I think the compelling comes with a cost, and that's what we've learned in a very hard way, that when with the NIST 853 and the whole standards was given was more like you take it and it's not prescriptive, and I think compilation really doesn't, whereas motivation works and incentives work, so definitely a great point. Moving on.
I was just going to say really quickly, there's a difference between thou shalt share and I want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jacques, Colonitarian, your thoughts on, you run a very unique organization. I don't know how many of them are there, but it's a think tank, and it's also developing norms and principles, and then sharing military strategies. Where do you see, in terms of the whole cyber adversary equation, what are your thoughts? With fundamental emphasis on the work that you're doing in CCDSC?
Yeah, I used to really trust private sector, but now when Rod stole my conclusions, you know, must have been that LinkedIn request I sent in or something. I don't know how it got. It was even on paper. I don't know how I did it, but sharing, yes. So let me try to build my way into that same conclusion. I'm fitting 3 cliches into the same sentence when I say that we live in a rapidly changing world, and the government is always one step behind, and the military is preparing for the last war. But you know, every cliche has some truth in it, and we are guilty at those. And when you talk about sharing between private and public and government and military, well, even within military, I didn't see it with my eyes, but I heard of a story in Afghanistan of an operational commander having 7 different computers physically separated on his desk to run on 7 different networks. So it can get pretty bad even inside military. So 5 years ago, I would have denied the request to be on this panel. That's cybercrime. That's not a, you know, committee of 21 member nations specifically said, you know, stay on the strategic issues on state-on-state cybercrime. But now really the line is blurring between cybercrime and the petty criminals and states acting as criminals. Let's take, you know, Estonians, who do we pick on? Russia. The NotPetya, what they released in Ukraine, to take down Ukraine, cause damage to Ukrainian economy, had big collateral damage in the world. Was it state-on-state? Kind of. Did it cause criminal damage? Yes, it did. So which is it? Is it cybercrime? Is it state action? North Korea, they already mentioned WannaCry, the Sony hacks. They fill their government budget by stealing on the internet as much as they can. Sometimes they attack a private company, Sony, if they release a film they don't like. You know, so it's blurring the line of theft. China stealing intellectual property, especially from the defense companies. Yes, it is a cyber crime. It's absolutely attack on U.S. national and entire Western world military security as well. It seems that everyone's kind of gotten the point that cyber is very important. We have all those cyber conferences, cyber talks. Well, the internet domain that was built to connect everything, I think it has created more stovepipes than before. I think we're sharing less, or maybe there is so much information that we just can't share everything, but the stovepipes and silos, it used to be intelligence that was not shared. Now it seems cyber has taken over. Cyber guys are the ones that know, nationalize only, red stamp on it. It's bad. Well, the adversaries, the criminals, they're sharing. They don't have those bureaucratic hindrances. You know, after 9/11, when their finances were cracked down by a hunt for a terrorist, they figured out cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are a great way to run criminal finances. Cybercrime as a service is out there. They can share data on jurisdiction and authority of our law enforcement agencies, which we don't share amongst ourselves. To geolocate themselves physically, their data, their places where there is less possibility of law enforcement agencies of getting them. So if we don't start sharing, cooperating, like you said, trying to be half a step ahead if we can, if it's possible for government, I don't know, and across all domains, interagency, within nations and international.
Absolutely, no, great points. So we'll come to in terms of you know, enabling the perspectives that we shared, I don't know whether it's threats, intelligence sharing, or it's you know, getting the government half a step ahead. Where do you see the technologists getting there? I mean, you have a long history of innovation, and how can we aid that journey?
Well, first of all, so I'll be the contrarian of this panel. Before talking about sharing, I think it's really important to realize that a lot of companies have extremely poor cyber hygiene. They don't really understand what's on their network. And before we can talk about sharing meaningful data, it's extremely important to get a grasp of the network itself, right? And really understand what's going on, what are the important assets, because then that's how you identify which assets are going to be under attack and which one need to be monitored, which it leads to a better dissociation between noise versus actual signal, right? And it's important because there is a clear asymmetry between the defenders and the attackers, right? We mentioned it multiple times this morning. It's intellectually stimulating to think that Russia or North Korea is going after my company. In practice, it can be somebody in his basement, right? And if I don't really have a good grasp of my network, if basically my basic defenses are down, then anybody can get in. So I really think that as an industry, we need to do a better job there to kind of elevate that. Now, when it comes to sharing specifically, there's a counterpoint to your point about like sharing with everybody is that criminals do get it as well, ultimately. I mean, I know that the ISACs are kind of fairly strict about who can get the data, but there is a known property, which is that when you have a secret, if it's shared by more than one person, it's basically leaked everywhere at some point. And attackers use this information to see if the attacks they do are being discovered, or is remain covered, and they can also change their MO, right? So it's very important to kind of balance full disclosure of that information sharing versus who gets it.
Yeah. So, I mean, taking that point forward, Denise, what works and what doesn't work? I mean, you have seen a long journey of information sharing, right? And then influenced a lot of how best practices have governed this place. So your thoughts on those lines?
So there's been a couple times, for example, in the financial sector, when we had the DDoS attacks in 2012, 2013. Actually, that was an absolutely brilliant example of public-private sharing and cooperation with each other, as well as within the financial community. And then we shared beyond that too. But the banks, I like to say, they typically tend to open the kimono to each other, and this time they opened the kimono and gave each other massages. And that makes people a little squeamish when they have that image or they think about it, but it absolutely was true. The sharing that happened there was just phenomenal. And it became so good that the attacker kept having to move on because the attacks became less efficient until eventually it dropped out. That also happened with Pecha, not Pecha, in the healthcare sector. What we did in health was amazing. I would say it's even better than finance. But the sharing that took place within 48 hours, we were able, and this was a group of probably 60 individuals from about 30 different companies within health, were able to not only verify what the actual true indicators were, what the threat vector was, and how to mitigate against it. And we developed a vaccine where we were able to show everybody, and we shared it broadly. So we didn't keep it within health or to the membership. We shared it across the globe about what you could do to help protect yourself against that attack. So absolutely, I think information sharing can mitigate against attacks and also help people protect themselves. We have a saying, one person's defense is everybody else's offense, and that's kind of the philosophy within that community. Where it doesn't work so far, I think there's a lot of reasons. I think, as I said when I opened, we are our own worst enemy when we don't want to share with each other. And there's a lot of reasons why that is the case. One could be we don't want to share with government for whatever reason. And I'm saying that from the private sector side. And then one could be that I feel intimidated by all the other guys sharing, that I may not be, they may think what I have to share is not important. So that's another, ego is another one, or lack of ego. So I think, we need to overcome all of our fears and concerns around sharing and really start to believe in it and do it in a trustworthy and effective way so that it benefits everybody as much as possible. Like we've alluded to, and I alluded to in the beginning, the criminals do it.
Yep.
So we should be doing it too.
Somebody's already said the best practices now, right? Your thoughts on Rod again? There is a sharing aspect, and then there is a governing aspect, also policy aspect, right? I mean, you have seen the world of this from long term. Like, where do you see this going in terms of the policy governance around this sharing?
Sure. And I'm going to relate it to a thought I actually had just listening to your comments and the other panelists, which is that, and I had a discussion earlier with someone, I think Jan or someone here, is that overall, I'm going to make an argument as an economist that there's no breakdown in the information sharing market. I mean, there's rich markets. They take place in many different forms. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of companies making lots of money on information sharing, including what we'd call software providers now, and service providers are really selling information. And so it's useful to think about that financial marketplace. But what I'm thinking about right now is that overlaid on that is a trust marketplace. And there's even places where you're exchanging the information without explicit financial value, such as in the ISACs, which are extremely successful and value information sharing platforms, which of course are governed by their industry members, which builds more trust. But if you begin to think of the sharing, because I've always thought of it kind of a peer-to-peer sense, and you decide which, as an agent, as a company or an individual or a research analyst or a firm, you're choosing which information sharing networks to engage in. Where do you need the information? What can you afford? And what can you give? And with all due respect to FS-ISAC, that I think the world of, there's an elite group of banks in New York City that only share information with each other first, okay? And then they decide whether those 7 or whatever the number is today share it with FS-ISAC. And that's fine. I think that's appropriate, because the reality is each of those tier 1 players is spending probably several $100 million a year, at least up to $1 billion, as we know, per annum just on cybersecurity. They're in an elite club. They have information security controls around what they're doing. They have people with very high levels of experience and clearances. So I'm not going to say that's a problem with the market. I'm going to call that a market efficiency. But so I want to think about these networks of information sharing, both in terms of the financial markets and then also trust-based market. And then I think trust is, of course, a very interesting topic to open up into. I tend to think of it on a transactional basis. I don't think of it on an ethical or a moral basis or a judgmental basis. And what does that mean? What it means is the way I analyze the trust of a party is what transactions are they willing to do with a different given party. There's someone different that I will trust to, manage my kids' money or manage my money, okay, is a different person than I will want as a babysitter, for someone's children, is different than the life insurance company or cyber insurance company I want, but that you really reflect your transaction, your trust in the transactions you take. So, do I trust eBay? I buy tons of stuff on eBay. I trust the parties? Well, I make an assessment, right? And I spend a lot on eBay every year. I lose very little, so it's a risk management game. And so do I trust everyone on eBay? Absolutely not. Same thing, information sharing. So back to it. You've got a market-based system that's going, all the companies trying to make money. You've got open platforms, but you have to pay to play too. You got to be a member in many cases to get your information. So there's a price tag there. So anyway, so that's how I'm thinking about it. And for the individual company or entities, you got to figure out what is the threat, right? What's the key threat to you? What is the data that you need to operate and to get your cyber level up next to protect your core assets?
So I think the bottom line is trust and transactional value and what it means to you. So absolutely. Taking this forward, Jacques, you mentioned about the lines being blurred between the government and private, from the public side and the private side. Why do you see your role from the military side and also thinking about sharing information within the board or advisory team that you got? Where does it go from that to what you share with the world? I mean, in terms of the norms and principles.
Well, specifically the CCD COE, we do very little classified stuff. We are unclassified research entity. We train and educate as well in addition to the research. So